Hello everyone, this is Pico Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we will review Superman and Lois, the premiere episode. This is of course the latest CW entry in the ever-growing DC superhero universe. Now there will be spoilers in this review, so if you haven't caught up yet with all of the CW shows, mostly in particular Supergirl, or if you haven't watched the recent crossover events, particularly involving the Crisis event, then I advise you maybe to stop watching now, go away, catch up with all of the Supergirl entries, or at least get a background knowledge of what has happened, and then come back to this review, because I will talk in depth about what happened within those shows when going over this particular story. Now, Superman and Lois continues the adventures of the Tyler Hoechin version of the character, who had been established already through the Supergirl series and also through those crossover events. Superman and Lois gives it a different dynamic because we are now concerning Superman, who has a married life. He's married to Lois Lane and he has 2 teenage sons, and he's having to really adjust and juggle life as the world's protector and savior, and also in terms of being a husband and also a father to 2 growing teenagers. So that's the really different dynamic and concept that they're bringing together throughout this CW show. So overall, I think this was a decent to solid episode. I think the Tyler Hoechin version is a very sound and a very good Superman version. I've commented on that through various episodes, that I think that this Tyler Hoechin version is a far more appealing and far more likeable version of the character than what we've seen within the DCEU, and that's really transferred throughout this entire episode. And I think much credit has to go towards Tyler Hoechin in the fact that he, for me, has given far more of a believable Clark Kent, of a believable Superman. This is a Superman that you can get behind, and we really feel towards this episode that this is a Superman that cares. He really cares about his family life, his relationship with Lois, and what it means to his sons and the potential impact that it could have on them if they find out about his identity. Now, there's been a lot of debate about the handling of Superman and how can they make him relevant, and the only way to make this character cross over to today's audiences if you make him more flawed, more conflicted, more vulnerable, and I've never agreed with that. This is one of the many issues that I had with the Zack Snyder version of Superman, is that this deconstructive, almost anti-hero take on the character is not true to what he is, not true to what he stands for, and it's a completely inappropriate take for the character. Now, many people have argued, well, the only way to make Superman interesting is to give him more flaws and defects and have him questioning himself. No, that's not the approach. The way to do it is to have the character remain true to who he is and give him fresh new challenges and issues, and that's dictated through the story that you're telling. And I think that's one of the best credits of this particular show, is that we have a Clark Kent who is completely comfortable with his role as the world's protector, but he has other issues in terms of his family life, and that's the way to do it. That's the way to give Superman different decisions, different choices to make without deconstructing the character, and that's one of the best qualities that I want to give towards this interpretation of Superman, and we see that throughout the episode here. So we had a quick early montage, basically Superman given a quick prologue, if you like, to how he came to Earth, how his parents brought him up, how he first became the role of Superman, and how he's found Lois, met up with her, became a reporter at the Daily Planet, became married and had 2 kids. And this is a good tactic overall. I think it was just a good way to introduce anybody, as crazy as it sounds, who is not familiar with the character, just a good way to bring them into the story and really establish that this was his own entity, separate, if you like, from the other CW shows. And I will talk about that later on without this review, but that was just a quick, good intro. They didn't really harbour too much in terms of his origin, and that was a smart way to do it. There was a very nice scene where we saw Tyler Hoechin in the original Superman costume, if you remember, way back from the Action Comics first issue, where he's got the smaller emblem and it's covered in black. That was a nice touch as well, and I think the CW shows are very good in providing those Easter egg references. But again, we get good scenes where we see Clark and Lois discussing and debating their life within Metropolis and whether they should tell their kids about Clark's identity. We see later on that Morgan Edge has taken over the Daily Planet and he's laying off certain staff. This includes Clark, and we get good scenes between both Clark and Lois about what are they going to do, where does their future lie. And I think this highlighted again the good chemistry that we have between Tyler Hoechin and Elizabeth Tuick, who plays Lois. There's a good rapport on there, and of course we would expect that because that's been built up through multiple episodes throughout Supergirl and the crossover events. And for me, this is a Clark and Lois that are very believable. Now, a lot of people criticise Superman because they think it's too happy of a storyline, it's too positive, everything's got to be more dark and intense. I've never subscribed to that fact. You can have elements of a much more of a dark storytelling within the Superman mythos, but you don't make the characters dark. And I think what was good about this episode is that Superman and Lois, they are happily married, but it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, right? They're not exactly rich, they're not overly wealthy. We find out later on that following the death of Martha Kent that we saw earlier on within the episode, that Clark and Lois have to decide on whether to retain the farm, because we saw that Martha had obtained it through some dodgy loans by Morgan Edge, or whether they have to stay in Metropolis. So we have a Clark and Lois that do have real life issues, that do have what we call more relatable problems, more relatable dilemmas, and that just made them more believable as a couple. We mentioned as well throughout watching the trailers how much more of a cinematic feel that this show has, and we did realise that this will be on HBO Max, so maybe it's had a much more of an inflated budget. Certainly within this episode itself, which was much more of a feature length. I think it was an hour overall in its runtime, and it was 90 minutes because after this you had various behind the scene featurettes added to it as well. But yes, you could feel that there was much more of a cinematic feel towards it, everything from the music to the scenery, particularly within the scenes within Smallville. So we go on now to the teenage sons, and I had a few issues. They did come across as a bit whiny, a bit unlikable. We have one son who is very much more at ease with himself, very much more confident, and then we have another son who is very much more of an introverted. We learn that he's got a very much of a social condition that Clark mentioned in the prologue sequence. And we see early on scenes where Clark is trying to connect between these two. He walks in on one son who's Instagramming with his girlfriend, I think it is, and then the other son is playing Mortal Kombat, or the DC versus Mortal Kombat, and he says he finds Superman boring, that's why he's playing Raiden. You know, just another good humour line there. And yeah, these are good scenes where we see Clark again struggling to find a connection between both of his sons. This is a running theme that I'm sure will be put out throughout the entire series. We see that the sons later on, they do discover the Kryptonian ship, and we get that very much of a emotional scene, or supposedly emotional scenes, where they finally confront Clark about his identity, and Clark reveals who he is, and we get that sequence where we see him lifting the truck again, very much pouring on the music and the Superman themes, and very much we get that great angle where he's lifting the truck on there, and that was a very good scene overall, I thought, as well. But yeah, I hope that we don't make these two teenage sons too much angst ridden. I understand that we have to go through the whole transition of them discovering powers, and there's good scope and potential here, because again we're going to see how Clark adjusts to each individual son and how they come to their various skill sets. So we're going to get multiple scenes where one adjusts to their powers better than the other one does, and this is a very similar narrative to what we saw in Black Lightning. If you remember that show, we have both the daughters Anissa and Jen and how they adjusted their powers, and especially throughout the season 1 where we saw Anissa was very enthusiastic about gaining her powers and she was training, and we contrast that with Jen, who was very much afraid of her powers, very scared as what was happening to her, and that narrative was built up throughout multiple seasons. And I think we're going to see something very similar with Superman and Lois as well. Have both sons adjust their powers throughout the season, and we see how they react to it differently, and how does Clark and Lois adjust to those two sons reacting to their powers. And that's very interesting. There's very much good scope out there, some very good ideas and good storytelling. We had another very good scene where we saw General Lane alerting Clark to the fact that there's a potential threat, there's a potential danger. They're looking at some security footage and they come across some Kryptonian symbols. And what was good about this scene is that this was following the recent funeral that they had for Clark's mother, who died earlier on within the episode. And Lois very much points out to Clark that while Superman is very important and she understands that he has a very significant role this isn't the right time right now because he's got to look after himself and his family. And that's a very interesting dynamic as well, the fact that we're showing Lois as much more of the supporting mother and a supporting wife. You know, throughout most interpretations, we've always showed Lois as this really hard, tough, cynical, go-getting reporter, but this is a different dynamic. You know, this is the very interesting that we would see Lois as far more family orientated, that she's far more concerned about Clark and his role. And what I liked about this as well is that this is a very supportive marriage. This isn't a marriage where one is talking down to the other, or one is very angry towards the other, or jealous of their particular role. Very much as what we've seen later on within Black Lightning. This is a supportive collaboration between the two, and I like the fact that we saw Lois concerned about Clark and his role within his family. And again, that's going to be something that's really going to be the foundation of this entire series. Now, that was a very good scene overall. Now, there were issues with this episode, and I think in particular with the pacing and the transition between scenes. And once again, this is something that's very typical throughout all of the CW shows. For some reason, I don't know why, their pilot episodes tend to be very hurried and very rushed. For some reason, there's this over eagerness to get through the initial introduction of these characters, and they want to very much get to the status quo where we get the superhero taking on the supervillains, right? And this went against the show and proved to its detriment, because there were so many sequences and plot points that were very good, but they were rushed through so much. And I think one of the biggest examples was indeed the death of Martha. You know, initially this was a very heartfelt moment, but it was over so quickly. We had this huge kind of emotional music. We had the scene where Clark rushed to the nurse and the nurse told her what happened, but it was over very quickly. And this was a sequence that really needed far more weight to it, and I think it would have had more weight if we had a few more scenes with Clark and his mother. I'm not saying that there had to be 3 or 4 episodes, but if we just had a few more scenes with them together and then we got the funeral, that's when it would have had far more impact and far more emotional significance. Another big example of this was the, if you want to call it, the major set piece where we saw Clark taking on the kind of cyborg figure that we saw without the trailers. Now, this should have been the big money sequence, as we see him fighting the assailant and they're flying up in the sky, they're flying through Metropolis and have this big fight sequence between the two. This should have been the big epic fight throughout this episode, but it proved not to be, because for some reason they intercut it with another scene where we saw Jonathan and the other son being involved in his party, and then the other son kisses this girl, and then he breaks out into a fight because the boyfriend is very jealous, and they're both fighting together. Now, for some reason they were intercutting this with the fight with the cyborg, and why? It undercut both scenes, which should have been the 2 biggest scenes throughout the episode, and it felt really choppy, really a bit sloppily edited, as we saw Clark fighting him in the sky, and then he gets stabbed by the kryptonite dagger. He's falling down, he is able to rip the kryptonite from himself. Now, a lot of interpretations, Superman wouldn't be able to do that. He then falls almost to the ground, he stops himself, and then he flies quickly to see his sons, and then we cut to that scene, and all of a sudden we see the fire brigades there and everything's on fire, and it was just really choppily edited, and almost to the point where you felt, have I missed a scene? I generally thought I missed a scene, or a scene had been edited out, and there was no smooth transition, there was no flow. And again, the scene where the other son supposedly transmits his heat vision and is seemingly burnt everywhere around him, that should have been a massive scene, that should have been a very much of an intense, suspenseful scene, and it wasn't. It was just completely edited out. It's almost as if the screenwriters felt that the running time was getting too close and they took this scene out. And that was one of a major example of, again, where the episode just had too much of a rush. The pace was too much, and the transition between each scenes wasn't handled very well, in my particular opinion. And I mentioned about the unlikability of the sons, and also the Lana Lang boyfriend Carl. He wasn't very likable. We don't know the that he's this fireman, and he's very supportive of Morgan Edge seemingly taking over Smallville. We know that Morgan Edge wants to retrofit the coal mines and and converting them much more into energy sources. This will create more jobs, but Lois Lane is very concerned about what will happen to the community in the long run. So he came off across as a bit of a douchebag, to be honest with you. Now, I don't know if they will try and redeem him in some capacity later on, whether we may get splitting up between him and Lana, whether they will build some more of a love triangle between Lana, Clark and Lois. We wait and see what happens in the future. Maybe he will eventually get some more superpowers and become a future antagonist of Superman. We've seen this love triangle stuff done so many times throughout the CW show, so maybe we will see that dynamic again, but he wasn't a very likeable character either. Now we come on to the main talk point that I think everybody will be mentioning, and that was the end scene of this episode, where we see that the Cyborg character is revealed to be Lex Luthor. He comes into the ship and she calls him General Luthor. Now, if you didn't know, this was revealed a while ago that we saw that this Lex Luthor is indeed black, and we knew this before, if you follow these shows, that they were casting a black actor for Lex Luthor. Now, this is something that is going to raise a lot of problems, and when we come to the concept of the show, there are continuity and connectivity issues, in particularly with the CW verse as a whole. Now, just in case you didn't know, the fallout from the Crisis event meant that all of the characters from the previous shows were all integrated on one Earth. Now, this of course made it a lot easier to write the crossover events, right? So you'd expect certain characters that we'd seen, particularly from Supergirl, if they were going to be in Superman and Lois, that they would be portrayed by the same actors, right? But that wasn't the case. And when I highlighted that I was going to do my review on Twitter, somebody pointed out to me, and it is a very much of a talking point, that a lot of the characters within Superman and Lois had already been established in Supergirl, right? So we're talking about, in particular, Lana Lang had already appeared in Supergirl, General Lane had already appeared in Supergirl, and of course Lex Luthor had appeared in Supergirl, and of course Morgan Edge had appeared in Supergirl. So if we are all on one Earth and we're all in one continuity, shouldn't they be played by the same actors from those shows? Why does everybody look different and they've been cast different, right? Now, of course, if this were the previous status quo, where everybody's of a different Earth, of a different parallel universe, then okay, you don't have to explain it. But we're all on one Earth now, and as far as we know, this Superman is still heavily connected to the Supergirl from the CW verse, right? Even though there was no mention of Supergirl at all. Now, we could argue that was the right thing to do, because we very much want to stay focused on the Superman story and don't start bringing in yet other shows. But it is a continuity issue. Why do all the characters all of a sudden look different? You know, you can't just establish one singular continuity, then all of a sudden start breaking the own rules that you set before. So that is an issue that the writers will have to address at some point, and it may indeed turn a lot of fans who are very much entrenched in this CW verse. So that's a dilemma for them going forward. But once again, back to the Lex Luthor issue. Again, why couldn't it have been the John Cryer version, which I thought was a very good version of the Lex Luthor? It wasn't as good as the Michael Rosenbaum interpretation, which for me is the best live action version that we saw from Smallville, but it was a very good interpretation, and that was something that you could have crossed over to Superman and Lois, particularly when we know that we are going to get the final season of Supergirl this year. So why didn't they use the same actors? Now, we don't know what will happen within Supergirl. Maybe there'll be some sort of cataclysmic or huge event that will mean somehow the universe will get wiped out or integrated more into Superman Lois. Some explanation as to why we're getting different versions of these characters, I don't know. But right now it is very confusing at this point. Now, it didn't necessarily hurt this particular episode, but it's something that we will be watching out for, again, because we've got a knowledge of the wider CW verse. So how do they address this problem? We will wait and see. But now, I clearly feel that this is a Lex Luthor for some other alternate version, some other alternate parallel universe. You can tell that by the tech he's using. It's very different from the one that we saw within the Supergirl series. So that's what I think this is. This is a future version. So yes, it will be interesting to see why. But once again, why do we have to use Lex Luthor? Why can't we just use another one of Superman's villains that we haven't seen incorporated yet within live action? So that was another criticism that I had throughout this show. So overall, I think it was a decent to solid episode. There were issues with the pacing, issues with the scene transition, but as a Superman interpretation, this is solid. This is a good version of the character, very well played by Tyler Hoechin. A Lois Lane, which is a good version, very well played by Elizabeth Tulloch. I like the chemistry between the two. I like the more upbeat and far more heartfelt and far more soulful tone of this Superman interpretation, far more appealing than a DCU version, and there is potential for some very good stuff here, but they just have to slow the pacing down and not be in such an eager rush to rush through all of these plot developments which have very good potential in them. And I just hope that the teenage sons themselves aren't as angst ridden. I understand we've got to have a coming of age storyline, but please don't make them too whiny or too complacent, because that will be very unappealing for me in the future. So overall, just a very solid job from this series with potential to be great. As I said before, there are 15 episodes, so hopefully they just get a much more of a fine tuning in terms of the storytelling and the pace of the storytelling, and then we could potentially have something truly special. So those are my thoughts and feelings and review on Superman and Lois, the opening premiere episode. Let me know what you think in the comments below. How did you feel it compared to other pilot episodes of the other CW shows? How do you feel that this Superman version compares to the Henry Cavill version of the Zack Snyder universe? Do you think it's superior? Do you think it's worse? If we indeed get another cinematic version of Superman, would you like it to have more in tone and spirit to what this Tyler Hoechin version will be? How do you think this episode will go in the future? And do you want to see multiple seasons of this Superman and Lois show going ahead for the future? So those are my thoughts and feelings and reviews. Please let me know what you think in the comments below. Please hit and like those subscribe and notification buttons and help me grow more reviews and content for you in the future. If there are any standout episodes throughout this series, then I will review them, and of course I will do a breakdown of the finale episode and the season overall. But those are my thoughts on Superman Lois, the premiere episode. That's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.